This was more than a power struggle. This conflict destroyed everything. One day, streets were silent. Next, they heard engines revving, tires screaming, and gunfire. A rivalry between two clubs quickly became a bloody war. Attacks were silent and fast. No one was safe while brothers fought. No rules, no ceasefires, only constant retribution, a spiral of violence that engulfed everyone. Two of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the world locked into a battle for survival, and there was no exit. The violence became inevitable, and the brutality, routine. This is the story of the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence, the war that left no one untouched. Armond's entry into the biker world. Armond Bletcher's journey to the Hells Angels wasn't sudden. It was slow, planned, and full of small, seemingly unimportant events that, in hindsight, led directly to his future in one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the world. His story didn't start with violence or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it was about carefully laid plans and moves that slowly changed his life. Armond was born in the late 1960s in a small town in the Midwest. His early life seemed to be like anyone else's. His father was a mechanic who worked long hours fixing engines, and his mother was a nurse who was very dedicated to her job. He came from a working-class family. Armond's dad had a lot of bad things happen to him in his life. He had worked with the rough edges of the working class, like working late at night, in factories, and always fighting the system. He heard these stories while he was in the garage with his father, watching him fix old motorcycles and smelling the oil and metal. Armond was interested in more than just the bikes. He was also interested in what they stood for in the world, a world where there were no rules and power wasn't given, but taken. This interest grew even stronger as Armond turned 13. He began to spend more time at bike shops in the area, where older bikers took him under their wing. They weren't Hells Angels members yet, but they lived by the same rules. They didn't care about what other people thought. They made their own rules, and they did whatever it took to stay alive. This was freedom for Armond. He wanted this life. Armond quickly got bored with the predictable and safe in a town where everyone else did the same thing. He didn't care about school and didn't want to follow the same paths as his friends. He found peace in the sound of engines and the vibrations under his hands as he sped down dirt roads. The first time Armond met the Hells Angels, it wasn't a big deal or a flashy meeting. It wasn't a loud, attention-grabbing meeting that started a big war or rivalry. It was quiet though. A quick look at a bar in the area. If you weren't paying attention, you might think this kind of subtle interaction was just a coincidence. But Armond wasn't looking for things that happened by chance. He knew what he wanted, and when he saw the Hells Angels, he saw a reflection of his own goals. They weren't just bikers, they were warriors in their own right. To be a part of that world would mean getting respect, power, freedom, and a place in a brotherhood based on loyalty, respect, and violence. Armond quickly became a part of that world. His rise didn't happen right away. There were no loud claims or violent fights that came with it. It began with small, planned moves instead. Armond was slowly brought into the club, first as a prospect and then as a full member. He had to prove himself to the Hells Angels by doing things, being loyal, and not giving up, not by making big claims or showing off his strength. At first, people didn't think Armond was a big deal. He was just another person, another face in the crowd, but his determination and drive quickly made him stand out. He didn't just follow the rules of the club, he loved them. He worked hard on every task and faced every challenge with a determination that couldn't be ignored. He quickly learned that in the Hells Angels world, respect wasn't given, it had to be earned, and Armond was willing to pay any price to get it. This wasn't a story about a young man trying to make it in a world full of bad people. The story was about a young man who knew he had to do more than just join the club to stay alive. He had to turn into a force. Armond knew that joining the Hells Angels would change his life forever. He was no longer just a guy fixing bikes in a garage. He was involved in something that was much bigger than him and would change his life forever. Armond didn't know it at the time, but joining the Hells Angels was not only the start of his journey, it was also the start of a bigger fight that would eventually lead to one of the most brutal biker wars the world had ever seen. This war would not only shape his legacy, but it would also change what it means to be loyal, violent, and part of the Hells Angels. Armond's strategic ascent. There wasn't any fanfare or show when Armond Bletcher joined the Hells Angels. He didn't want to be a leader right away. He didn't focus on something as obvious as power. Instead, he focused on something much more subtle: influence. You don't get power or influence in the Hells Angels by making loud statements or trying to take over. You get it by doing things consistently, being loyal, and knowing how the club works. Armond's job was easy at first. Without question, he did what he was told. He cleaned the bikes, made the runs, and did the small things that came with being a prospect. But it was never just about getting the job done. Armond knew that what you did and how you did it were both important in this world. Armond stood out from other candidates because he could stay out of the spotlight while still showing that he was always a step ahead. It didn't take long for his fellow members to notice how well he paid attention to details, how well he saw things coming, and, maybe most importantly, how well he kept his cool under pressure. Armond didn't act on impulse like a lot of other people did. He knew how important it was to be patient and wait for the right time. Armond's real test of loyalty wasn't how well he could ride or how many drinks he could buy the guys at the bar. It was about getting to know the deeper things that were going on in the club. Like many other illegal groups, the Hells Angels had a set of rules that weren't written down. It wasn't just about being loyal to the club, it was also about being loyal to the men who had been there longer. But what Armond really understood was that power in this world wasn't always about being strong. It was about having power over information and resources. Armond started to build his own network of informants, members who were loyal to him, even if only in small ways. He didn't use them without thinking. There was no need for him to. What mattered was that he had a system that let him stay informed without being the center of attention. These quiet moves marked the change from prospect to full-fledged member. He wasn't pushed into the spotlight. Instead, he worked in the background, gaining the trust of those around him. Armond thought about and planned every move he made. He didn't take chances unless he was sure he could handle the results. It's easy to think that being quiet means you're weak in the world of the Hells Angels. Armond, on the other hand, used silence as a tool. He only talked when he had to, and most of the time, his actions spoke for themselves. He knew that rushing to the front lines would only draw unwanted attention when he was trying to make a name for himself. Instead, he kept a low profile and picked his moments carefully. Armond also started to learn how to negotiate in a careful way. Some of his friends were quick to use violence to get what they wanted, but Armond knew there were other ways to do it. He learned how to make deals with other clubs, how to calm things down with the police, and how to get around in the complicated world of illegal businesses. He knew that a biker club's strength didn't just come from its ability to fight, it also came from its ability to survive and change. Armond's name began to spread as the years went by. He was no longer just a member of the Hells Angels. He had become one of the most important people in the club, but he never wanted to be famous for his own sake. It was about making sure the club stayed alive and did well in a world that was always changing. Armond knew that the Hells Angels' real strength wasn't in how well they could fight, but in how well they could take it. And so, as Armond moved up the ranks, he did so with a quiet confidence. Like the club itself, his power came from patience, loyalty, and an unshakable faith in the brotherhood. He knew that the road ahead would be hard, but he was ready for anything that came his way. This was only the start of his trip. Armond and the Sons of Silence. Armond Bletcher never rushed into fights. Things were never as easy as they looked in the world of the Hells Angels. The tension that built up around him didn't make a lot of noise or need to be dealt with right away. It was a slow-moving force that built up steadily and almost without anyone noticing until it became too heavy to ignore. The Sons of Silence Motorcycle Club, a rival group that had been hanging around the edges of the Hells Angels territory for a long time, had been getting more and more attention in the last few months. Before anyone else, Armond saw this. He wasn't the kind of person to react right away, especially when it came to something as sensitive as territory. He knew the rules: never act too soon, because you didn't want to make things worse than they had to be. But it was clear what the signs meant. The Sons of Silence weren't just passing through, they were going to stay. It wasn't a reason to worry at first. They were sneaky in their approach, and nothing about it felt dangerous right away. It started with little things, like one or two Sons of Silence members at a bar in the area with their patches on backs that weren't theirs. They seemed like just another group of people passing through who weren't causing any real trouble, but as the weeks went by, it started to feel like they were there on purpose. Armond began to see these familiar faces in the same places, at the same bars, on the same corners, and at the same gas stations. There wasn't a huge invasion, but the Hells Angels were slowly taking over areas they had long claimed as their own. the Sons of Silence were very quiet about it, which made it different. They weren't trying to make big moves or send clear signals. There was no fight, no yelling or showing off. They were careful and patient, and that made it worse. The silent, unspoken challenge they posed began to feel like an undeniable truth. They weren't just passing through, they were claiming their space. Armond wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but he could feel the pressure building up slowly as the weeks turned into months. There were more than just a few extra riders on the streets. It was a change. Bars that the Hells Angels had been going to for years now had a lot of new people in them, and it wasn't just the bars. The whole area felt different. The energy in the air and the usual meetings and rides had started to feel a little off. The Sons of Silence weren't being mean yet. They didn't have to be. They were already making claims. Armond understood that the world of motorcycle clubs wasn't just about physical space. This set him apart from many other people in the club. It was about power. Territory was just a sign of power, and in the world of outlaws, power was everything. If another club started to move into your area, even in a small way, it was a direct threat to your power. And Armond knew very well that you could never afford to lose power. When someone crossed the Hells Angels, violence was often the first thing they did. But Armond didn't want to hurt anyone right away. Over the years, he had learned that the second move was more important than the first. Violence had to be clear when it happened. It couldn't be done quickly, not with so much on the line. The Sons of Silence were still in the early stages of trying to take what the Hells Angels thought was theirs, but the signs were clear. There was a storm coming. Armond wasn't going to let the Hells Angels catch him off guard. Armond started to pay close attention. Every ride, every meeting, and every time club members talked to each other, he heard the whispers and the quiet talks that weren't meant to be heard. Some of the Hells Angels leaders, who were older than Armond, were starting to feel the same way, but none of them had made up their minds about what to do yet. They were waiting, just like Armond. The first real act of confrontation didn't happen until a quiet evening in late spring. Armond and some of his friends from the club were riding when they stopped at a bar they had been going to for years. As they parked their bikes and walked to the door, he saw something that made him shiver. A few Sons of Silence members were already inside, sitting at the bar where they usually do. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was hard, and it wasn't hard to see. Armond's calculated retaliation. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, the calm moments never lasted long. What had begun as a small change in the balance of power between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence was now getting worse in ways that even Armond Bletcher had not expected. His quiet standoff at the bar was planned. It was a test of power and a message to the Sons of Silence that the Hells Angels shouldn't be pushed aside. But that wasn't the end of it. People didn't know the Sons of Silence would back down, and they didn't like being shown up. What happened next was an escalation that neither side could stop. After the tense meeting at the bar, small acts of revenge started to happen. They were small, but there was no doubt about them. Armond heard rumors that Sons of Silence members were showing up in Hells Angels territory and acting bolder than ever. People saw them in places they had never been before, like bars and hangouts that were once thought to be off-limits. There was no fighting or open hostility. There was just an undeniable feeling that the ground was moving under everyone's feet. Armond looked and waited. He knew that the Sons of Silence wouldn't just give up. They were just as deeply involved in the world of outlaw biker culture as the Hells Angels, and they didn't want to give up. But they didn't get that the Hells Angels weren't a club that backed down when someone challenged them. Armond had grown up in the Hells Angels culture, where the club's survival depended on being the best, not backing down. Because of this, Armond didn't act right away. This was the time to be patient. It wasn't about hitting right away. It was about controlling the pace. The Sons of Silence had taken their first step, but they hadn't gone very far. Yet, Armond quickly realized that the Sons of Silence weren't the only problem. The real danger was that violence tended to get worse once it started. He had seen it happen in other places. Rival clubs would fight, and things would quickly get worse. The first fight led to another, and then another, until it all became a blur of violence with no clear end in sight. And in that kind of war, even the smallest mistake could cause a lot of trouble. Armond did not want things to get out of hand. He wanted to be in charge. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between the two clubs kept rising. The Sons of Silence were getting bolder and going deeper into places that the Hells Angels had long thought were theirs, but there was still no direct violence. Armond knew they were just trying to see how far they could go without pushing too hard. One of the Sons of Silence chapters decided to push their luck even further, and that's when things changed. They did something that couldn't be ignored. They attacked a business owned by the Hells Angels. The Sons of Silence chose a bar that was not only a favorite hangout for Hells Angels members, but also a big moneymaker for the club. It wasn't just a raid, it was an attack on the Hells Angels' power in the area. They broke windows, made a mess, and left a clear message. The Sons of Silence were not going anywhere. Armond had been expecting a small-scale response, but this wasn't it. This was an act of violence, and it changed everything. Armond felt the heat of the moment right away. There were no more small changes or passive-aggressive moves. The Sons of Silence had made a stand, and they weren't going to back down. The Hells Angels had to act now, and their response had to be quick and clear. Armond knew this was the time he had been waiting for, the time when the rules of the game changed. The plan wasn't just to hit back, it was to send a message. Armond didn't want a fight that would cause chaos in public. He wanted to hit them exactly right, so that the Sons of Silence would know they were wrong, and that they would never be able to work freely in Hells Angels territory. The attack happened quickly. Armond got a group of Hells Angels together, and they all went to the Sons of Silence's own territory. Not only did they hurt things, they also took control. They messed up the Sons of Silence's business in a way that shook the rival club to its core. The message was clear: the Hells Angels were in charge of this area, and anyone who tried to take it would be met with overwhelming force. The war ignites. Open confrontation. The little fights and tense times had been building up, but now the floodgates opened. Armond Bletcher knew that once the retaliation started, there was no going back. The Sons of Silence had made their first big move. They attacked the Hells Angels' territory, which was more than the small problems they had caused before. Now it was time for the Hells Angels to act. No more waiting. This was the point at which threats and words turned into something much worse. The first blow had been struck, but it was only the start of a war that would grow and consume both clubs. The Sons of Silence had chosen a famous bar owned by the Hells Angels as their target. It wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a clear challenge. Armond knew that the Sons of Silence were trying to get the Hells Angels to do something. They knew that how they responded first would set the tone for everything that came after. It was clear from the message that we were no longer on the sidelines. We're coming for your spot in this world. Armond had to do something. Weakness was never an option for the Hells Angels. The Sons of Silence were very wrong to think they could take over this area without any consequences. You could feel the anger and frustration in the Hells Angels' ranks. People were angry, but they were also hurt. Armond was determined to lead the response because the Sons of Silence had gone too far. Armond's way of doing things wasn't reckless aggression. He knew that in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, acting on impulse could lead to much worse things. No, the revenge had to be exact. A show of strength that would send a clear message to the Sons of Silence. He didn't want to get into a fight. He needed to show strength by making a planned attack that would make it clear that the Hells Angels would not put up with this challenge to their power. Armond planned the attack very carefully. A few Hells Angels members, chosen for their experience and ability to keep things under control, were given the job. They weren't going to attack the Sons of Silence's headquarters or start a full-blown fight. Instead, they would stop the Sons of Silence from doing their jobs, hurt important things, and make sure the Sons of Silence knew that they would have to pay for coming into Hells Angels territory. The Sons of Silence's clubhouse was attacked in just a few hours. They stole bikes, broke things, and took apart their property. Armond made sure that the message got through without too much bloodshed. The Sons of Silence would be in a mess, but the Hells Angels would still be the most powerful group in the area. But Armond didn't expect the quick response that came next. The Sons of Silence weren't as quiet as he had hoped. They didn't run away into the dark. Instead, they hit back just as hard. It was clear that they weren't going to back down. They were in this for the long haul, and just as Armond thought, everything started to go wrong as soon as the first strike was made. A few days later, a Hells Angels chapter house was attacked. This time, it wasn't just an attack on property, it was an attack on the men themselves. They were outnumbered, and even though no one was hurt badly, The message was clear. The Sons of Silence weren't going to give up easily. Now the stakes were much higher. There was a cycle of violence, and neither side could afford to back down without looking bad. The Hells Angels weren't known for being calm, but Armond knew how important it was to keep things from getting worse. He knew the Sons of Silence had made their move, and the only way to stop it was to take control early on. He decided to fight back, but not with mindless violence. Instead, he would make strategic moves that would shake the Sons of Silence to their core. Every move had to be planned, and every strike had to be on purpose. There was no space for errors. The way the Hells Angels reacted depended on Armond's leadership. He was more than just a fighter. He was a strategist. He knew how to read the situation and when to make each move. This was no longer just a fight between gangs. It had turned into a fight for power, control, and survival. Armond was ready to lead the charge to show the Sons of Silence that they had gone too far. The Sons of Silence thought that being aggressive would scare the Hells Angels, which was a mistake. But Armond knew what these fights were all about. A war in the shadows. Things didn't slow down after the first wave of revenge. The Sons of Silence didn't think twice about making things worse after Armond's planned response hurt them. It was no longer just a fight for land. It was about staying alive, showing off, and proving who was in charge. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, pride was everything. What had begun as a single attack had turned into a full-blown war, with both sides getting ready for the next move. The Sons of Silence knew they couldn't look weak. Their leaders had already shown that they were willing to work with the Hells Angels, so now it was time to fight back. The Sons of Silence, on the other hand, were more reckless than the Hells Angels, who used precise and planned violence. Their response was quick, brutal, and public, a kind of violence that couldn't be ignored. This time, it wasn't a planned attack. It was an ambush. A group of Sons of Silence members went to a Hells Angels chapter house in the middle of the night, hoping to surprise the members. There were broken windows, stolen bikes, and hurt bodies everywhere during the attack. The Sons of Silence were clearly not following the same rules anymore. This was the moment when everything changed for the Hells Angels. Armond had always been proud of being able to stop things from getting worse. He knew that once violence got out into the streets, there was no way to stop it. But the Sons of Silence had gone too far. Not only were they trying to scare the Hells Angels, they were also trying to kill them, one by one. It was a direct attack on the Hells Angels' main source of power. Armond knew he couldn't wait any longer. The Sons of Silence had made it personal. The attack wasn't just a message, it was a call to arms. And now the Hells Angels had to do the same thing. It wasn't about land anymore. It was about proving that the Hells Angels couldn't be pushed around. It wasn't a fight to be the best. It was a fight to stay alive. The response came quickly. Armond was now in charge of the response and planned a series of attacks that would hit the Sons of Silence where it hurt the most. He didn't go after the people who were members of their group directly, at least not yet. Instead, he went after their resources, businesses, and places of business. He knew that the Sons of Silence would lose the ability to keep fighting if they couldn't keep their operations going. The Hells Angels sabotaged their rivals' businesses, which included bars, clubs, and motorcycle shops. They took bikes, broke things, and made it very clear, if you want a war, we'll give it to you. The Sons of Silence may have thrown the first punch, but the Hells Angels would make sure that everyone in their world felt the pain of the attack. But Armond didn't expect the rising tension among his own members. Some Hells Angels didn't agree with the violence getting worse. There were whispers of worry. Is this the right way to go about things? Was the club being too pushy and too obvious? Violence was the club's main business, but it was always dangerous when it got to the level it was at now. It was hard to tell where the line was between being in charge and getting the police to come down on you hard. But Armond wasn't going to let his club back down now. The Sons of Silence had made it clear that they weren't going to back down. The Sons of Silence were in it for the long haul, and the more the Hells Angels fought back, the more they felt strong. The competition between the two clubs was now spreading all over the area. The attacks got bigger, better organized, and happened more often. This was no longer a small fight. It was a war that could only end when one side won. The violence got worse as the weeks went by. What had been a few small fights turned into full-blown gang wars. The Sons of Silence were getting bolder in their attacks, and the Hells Angels had to move quickly. Armond was pulled deeper into the fight, not just as a leader, but also as a strategist. Every choice and action had to be thought out. There were no more times when they hesitated. The police started to pay attention, and the pressure started to rise. The police were coming more often, breaking into known clubhouses and making arrests. But in the world of outlaw clubs, having police around was more of a bother than a deterrent. Armond knew that the more violence there was, the more the police would pay attention. Collateral damage, the cost of war. As the Hells Angels and Sons of Silence fought, it became clear that the fight was bigger than just them. A fight over land turned into a war, and every day the damage got worse. Armond Bletcher never thought about how far-reaching the effects would be while he was leading his club through the crisis. The first collateral effect was on local businesses. The Hells Angels and Sons of Silence used bars, clubs, and stores. These places where people could meet were important to the network that helped both clubs break the law. These businesses were hurt as violence grew. Bar owners were stuck in the middle because they couldn't ignore the growing tensions, even though they had ignored the club's activities. Bars that Hells Angels went to were targeted. Sons of Silence go after Hells Angels' resources to make statements, not just to punish their enemies. Vandalism of property, damage to bikes, and attacks on employees hurt the clubs and longtime businesses in the area. What had been peaceful for outlaw bikers turned dangerous for everyone. Armond never meant to hurt the livelihoods of innocent people. Hells Angels have always had a code that balanced violence with respect for the community. Respect went away as violence spread. Every strike made it harder for Armond to keep that exact balance. It was more than just beating the Sons of Silence. It was also about keeping a war that was getting out of hand under control. The ripple effect was unavoidable. When businesses were hurt, owners had to make decisions. Some people openly or secretly backed one club over another. Some people quietly left both clubs. The business network and partnership that used to be strong were now falling apart. The community that had long supported the club's illegal activities was pulling back, making it harder for both sides to keep the fight going. But it wasn't just businesses that were having a hard time. The Hells Angels were worried about the rise in violence. The group came together at first to protect their land and show their superiority, but as the fight went on, some of the older members started to feel uneasy. They had always fought for respect, but they didn't expect this level of violence and destruction. They always knew what it meant to be in an outlaw motorcycle gang, but now the stakes seemed higher than ever. Armond felt that people's attitudes were changing. Some of his members asked if the fight was worth it. But Armond knew that once violence got to this point, it couldn't be stopped. You couldn't ignore this fight. The Sons of Silence had made their intentions clear, so the Hells Angels had to do something. Not acting now shows weakness. No one could afford to be weak in this world. During this time of internal unrest, law enforcement got more involved. Police are paying more attention to incidents that used to be isolated. It became common for there to be more patrols, surveillance, and raids. Armond knew that the authorities would definitely go after them as long as the fighting continued. The police were aware of the Sons of Silence, but the Hells Angels always stayed one step ahead. But this time, the war was too obvious, and the police were more forceful in stopping the violence. It was a test of Armond's leadership. He was now in charge of getting his club through a crisis, not just a turf war. The Sons of Silence had the Hells Angels trapped, so Armond had to negotiate a fight that could have destroyed the club and everything they had worked for. He used to make decisions based on strategy, but now he had to make them under a lot of stress. Every choice he made had an effect on the Hells Angels and the neighborhood they used to control. It was clear that war took a toll on the body. People on both sides were hurt and killed. The Sons of Silence and the Hells Angels were no longer afraid. When it hurt the Hells Angels, Armond felt the real cost the most. People who used to be friends were now enemies. The club's history of loyalty was falling apart because of the never-ending war. Armond didn't think that the violence would break the Brotherhood's strong bond. The Sons of Silence pushed back harder than ever, testing the loyalty that had kept the Hells Angels together. Would they have to fight to stay alive, or would their biggest loss be their own division? Armond said that the Hells Angels were at a crossroads because of rising violence, ruined businesses, and police attention. The club's spirit was hurt, along with broken motorcycles and stolen property. He realized that could be the most dangerous death. The turning point. When blood was shed, the Hells Angels and Sons of Silence fought at a very important time. After a series of small fights, retaliations, and land disputes, the area was now at war. It was clear what was at stake because the attacks were happening more often and were more violent. Armond Bletcher had spent years dealing with club politics and rivalries, but he was starting to see that this fight was different. As the line between survival and disaster got smaller, someone would make the fatal choice that would change everything. Sons of Silence never gave up. Their strikes used to be smart and planned, but now they were violent, not just claiming land anymore. They wanted to break the Hells Angels, both physically and mentally. Armond had known for years that bloodshed was coming. The Sons of Silence didn't just cause violence, they also caused chaos. In their world, anarchy could take over everything. The fight got worse when a Hells Angels convoy was ambushed, and there was no way to stop it. It was supposed to be a calm ride through familiar streets between chapters. The Sons of Silence waited because they had learned from their mistakes. They watched the convoy's movements and patterns to know when to attack. They did it with a lot of power. The attack was quick and brutal. The Sons of Silence set up traps on high ground and in hidden places along the convoy's path. There was no warning or time to act. It was too late by the time the Hells Angels saw it. One Hells Angel died, and 2 others were seriously hurt. Ambush was more than just a technique. It was an execution. It was clear that the Sons of Silence would not back down. They were in it for the long haul and would do anything to hurt the Hells Angels. Armond was shocked by the news. He thought there would be fights and a little bloodshed, but not this. When a member died, different losses happened. It wasn't just a death in battle, it was a call to arms. Armond knew that the Hells Angels couldn't let this go unpunished, the point of no return. There was more than just land at stake. This was about me. Armond called the leaders of the Hells Angels right after the ambush. There was a lot of anger in the room. Members who had preached caution and measured responses were hit by vengeance. They fought not for land, but for the memory of a brother who had died. The club felt the loss, not just the members. In outlaw biking, losing a brother was a direct attack on their beliefs. The Sons of Silence said this was no longer a game, it was a fight. There were no rules in battle. Armond answered right away. He didn't want chaos, but he needed revenge. He knew the Hells Angels had to do something, because the Sons of Silence had gone too far. No doubt allowed. The time of strategic strikes is over. The time for the statement has come. That statement would be clear and not up for debate. The Hells Angels struck back hard in the days that followed. They destroyed important Sons of Silence strongholds. This was no longer a secret war. The gloves were off. The Sons of Silence had to run away after a huge Hells Angels attack that involved stealing bikes and burning down clubhouses. Not just an attack, but a statement. Armond made it clear that the Hells Angels will not be pushed around. Armond thought the fight would go even after the counterattack. Sons of Silence didn't give up easily. After that, everything changed. A fight over land that had been going on for a long time had turned into a full-blown battle of attrition. There was no way out for either side. They had both lost men and suffered damage. The only choice was to keep fighting until one side won. In the weeks that followed, the violence got worse. Streets that both clubs knew well quickly became battlegrounds. The Hells Angels, led by Armond's strategist, moved, but they weren't the only ones. Sons of Silence hit back harder and faster. It was now a full-blown war where every move and hit mattered. The stakes have never been higher. Armond kept asking about the Hells Angels' future during all of this. Every day, war cost a lot of money and hurt a lot of people. The Sons of Silence trapped the Hells Angels, making it impossible for them to get away. The only way to move forward was to fight. It was not clear, though, if the Hells Angels would survive a battle that was destroying everything they had built. There was no other option. The only thing left to do after the blood was shed was to fight until the war was over, not to win, but to stay alive. No turning back. The war becomes public. No one could have predicted how much worse the war between the Hells Angels and the Sons of Silence had gotten. What had begun as a series of small fights and disagreements over land had turned into a full-blown war, and the effects of their actions were beginning to be felt by the public. Armond Bletcher, who was in charge of a lot of the Hells Angels' plans, was starting to see the truth. There was no way to go back. The violence, destruction, and death had already gotten to the point where neither side could afford to back down. It was no longer just a fight for land, it was a fight to stay alive. The violence in this case was different from previous ones because it happened in public. In the past, criminals worked in secret, away from the public's watchful eyes. The attacks were quick, accurate, and only happened in certain places. But every day, the violence was getting easier to see. Law enforcement had long ignored the activities of illegal clubs, but they could no longer ignore the rising tide of disorder. The Sons of Silence had gotten bolder, and the Hells Angels had fought back just as hard. The streets were no longer just battlefields, they were now war zones, and the public could no longer ignore the violence. Armond had always been careful to keep the war out of the public eye, but he knew that with each new attack, it became less likely that he would stay hidden. The Sons of Silence had started to go after places that were hard to miss, like busy intersections, crowded bars, and public places where regular people went. The violence was getting more and more reckless, which made it more likely that people would see it. Armond didn't want the police or the media to turn the war into a show. They couldn't afford the kind of attention that would come with it, but it was too late to change the story. People were now paying attention to the Hells Angels, whether Armond liked it or not. Stories about the growing violence between the two clubs started to show up in the news. At first, there were reports of fights breaking out in bars, but soon the stories got worse. Now, shootings, bombings, and attacks were on the front page. Law enforcement started to take action, sending out raids and investigations into both the Hells Angels and Sons of Silence. Armond was worried about what people outside of the war would think for the first time. The chance of getting arrested, watched, or having the police crack down had never been higher. As the war spread to the public, both clubs felt more pressure. Armond could no longer afford to be as careful and planned as he had been in the past. It was no longer enough to win small fights in the fight for survival. They had to stay ahead of the police and keep the public's view of the Hells Angels under control. If the war went on any longer, the club would not win. It would be completely destroyed. Armond stayed determined, even though more and more people were watching. He knew that in their world, there was no room for weakness. There was no way to retreat. The Sons of Silence were pushing harder because their public strikes had given them more confidence. Their attacks had gotten worse and more public. The Hells Angels had to respond in kind. But now Armond had to think about how the police and the public were becoming more aware of the situation. Someone was watching every move, and one wrong step could mean the end of the club. The Hells Angels hit back with all their might. They fought back against the Sons of Silence in more and more public and violent ways. The attacks got bigger and more out of control, and people cared less about collateral damage. Vehicles were blown up, and clubhouses were bombed in broad daylight. It seemed like the lines between the secret world of outlaw bikers and the outside world had completely disappeared. The violence had turned into a show that both the public and the police could no longer ignore. At the same time, the pressure from politics and society was growing. Politicians, eager to show they were doing something, started pushing for stricter laws that would make motorcycle clubs illegal. The media, which loves to report on shocking stories, had plenty to work with. The Sons of Silence and the Hells Angels were no longer just two rival clubs. They were the focus of a media frenzy across the country, and the law was fully behind them. Armond knew that if this war didn't end soon, it would ruin everything the Hells Angels had worked for. The Hells Angels had to change their plans in the middle of all this chaos. The club changed its approach from direct confrontation to more planned, secret operations. The Hells Angels couldn't keep fighting in public. People were paying too much attention to them. The war that consumed them all, fighting between the Hells, Angels, and Sons of Silence, escalated until negotiation was impossible. A conflict over territory and pride had escalated into a war no side could afford to lose. Each Hells Angel, including Armond Bletcher, no longer cared if they won. Only how much of themselves would remain thereafter was their concern. Both teams had lost players, and the war's cost was becoming apparent daily. The Sons of Silence hit harder than Armond expected, and the Hells Angels were stressed from fighting back. The streets had become battlefields, and the skies above them perpetually threatened violence. Attacks and retaliation continued without a break. Armond knew this couldn't last. Violence hurt the Sons of Silence and Hell's Angels. Casualties were growing, and the physical and mental damage to its members was too great to overlook. Unending violence was breaking apart a fraternity of shared objectives and loyalty. Some members were beginning to question if the constant struggle, possibility of death or incarceration, and uncertainty of the future were worth it. Their lives revolved around the war, which seemed to never stop. People who didn't understand outlaw motorcycle clubs now do. Rising violence, deaths, and street destruction were reported in the news. Politicians wanted tougher biker gang laws. At the same time, law enforcement became increasingly forceful. The Sons of Silence and Hell's Angels now fought the law as well as each other. The issue was new for Armond. He was competent at getting around in a lawless society, but now the stakes were higher. Streets, courtrooms, news conferences, and brains were all battlegrounds. Hell's Angels have always been proud of their stealth and nighttime skills. Pressure mounted now that they were in the spotlight. Both sides lost individuals, but it wasn't simply fighting deaths that hurt. Loyalty was declining. Former Hell's Angels wondered if they were on the right track. Some withdrew because they couldn't reconcile the brutality with their values. This was Armond's hardest portion. He always thought Hell's Angels valued brotherhood and loyalty most. But suddenly, he noticed holes in that foundation, making him doubt everything he had labored for. The Sons of Silence felt the strain. Instead of being the underdogs, they were against one of the world's most feared clubs. They had the edge of surprise at first, but it was fading. The battle eroded their advantage. They became increasingly desperate in their short, random attacks. Hell's Angels were becoming more organized and powerful. The Sons of Silence debated its value. Were the costs of fighting too high? Both clubs were in a payback cycle. Each onslaught exacerbated the war. There was no peace or settlement. All sides were too stubborn, proud, and dedicated to give up. However, Armond realized this fight was unwinnable. The war's true cost was the mental and emotional toll on everyone, not the physical destruction. Both sides were tired of living in danger, watching their backs, and knowing every day could be their last. Violence had become routine, causing numbness. Hell's Angels, their families, communities, and support networks suffered. Everyone suffered from this deep war. Next, Armond thought about what would happen. Could Hell's Angels survive? Would they emerge from the conflict with their reputation intact or broken? Just another group of crooks lost in violence. Both Hell's Angels and Sons of Silence were powerful. Both sides wanted to battle, but Armond realized the question was what they would leave behind, not who was stronger. Winning was no longer the goal of the battle. Survival was key. As both sides kept bleeding, it became evident that no one would be unscathed when the dust settled.